Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to historian and journalist Christine Rosen about how American religious leaders, in partnership with philanthropy, helped grow the American eugenics movement in the first part of the 20th century. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. All right. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are recording on February 10th, 2022 in sunny, beautiful, tourist-swamped Phoenix, Arizona. And I can't think of a few better ways of spending this beautiful day than by talking to someone as intelligent and accomplished as Christine Rosen. Christine is senior writer at Commentary Magazine, fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, and senior editor at The New Atlantis. Christine holds a PhD in history from Emory University. Her writing has appeared in our most prestigious periodicals, from the New York Times Magazine to the Washington Post, the MIT Technology Review to the New England Journal of Medicine, often covering the science/bioethics/technology beat. And she is the author of several books, including My Fundamentalist Education, and a forthcoming volume titled The Extinction of Experience. I am particularly pleased to speak with Christine because her 2004 book, Preaching Eugenics, Religious Leaders and the American Eugenics Movement, was very important in shaping my own views on charity versus philanthropy, on the rhetorical uses and misuses to which science is often put, and on the dark side of American progressivism. So we're going to focus our talk today on that book, which I could not more highly recommend, and on what we should learn from it. Welcome, Christine Rosen.
Thanks so much for having me.
It is our pleasure. Thanks for going back into the mists of time to the early 2000s when you must have been working on this book, if not earlier, and trying to remember what you had to say. I'm sure you've revisited it often since then, but I also know that's difficult to do. Maybe you could just start by having you talk to us a little bit just about the history of eugenics in America. I don't think it's something even the highly intelligent listeners of this podcast necessarily know a lot about. Just a little thumbnail on, what was the big idea behind eugenics? When did the movement become popular? Maybe who were two or three of its central proponents to start there?
It's funny. I think I came to the subject of eugenics the way a lot of Americans do who study history, which is with surprise, because it's not something I ever learned about in my regular history books as a kid or even as a college student. It was mentioned once or twice, almost always in the context of Nazi Germany and the practice of eugenics as being something that the Nazis embraced. And so as a grad student, I started exploring late 19th, early 20th century race theory and, the ways in which scientists were trying to justify racial hierarchies and obviously often very pernicious laws in this country. So eugenics actually started, Charles Darwin's cousin, a British scientist named Francis Galton, coined the term, meaning good in birth. And the idea was that you could improve the human race through better breeding. So just in the same way that you might cultivate plants to have the healthiest and strongest plants flourish, or maybe breed racehorses for speed and agility, this could be applied to humans. Now, we now know with the benefit of hindsight and many decades of genetic science that this is not possible. But at the time, the idea did take hold and flourish using things, pretty rudimentary techniques like gathering family histories, trying to study certain traits that might be passed down from generation to generation. So in the United States, there were several scientists who embraced this, beginning really in the late 19th, early 20th century. There were a lot. Charles Davenport is the name that most people end up coming across. He established something called the Eugenics Record Office and was one of the more outspoken scientists who pursued eugenics. But these ideas were in the air even if they weren't called eugenics. And by that I mean people were concerned about transformations in society and they wanted to find solutions to the problems they saw. They saw problems of poverty, they saw what they felt to be overcrowding in cities, new waves of immigrants coming from parts of the world with which they were unfamiliar, and a general sense that society was under siege from major problems that didn't have individual solutions, and that our old ways of fixing these problems, our old ways of alleviating poverty or health problems weren't working. So there was a real sense of urgency across the land, particularly for those who worked in churches and in charities and philanthropies, to find solutions. And so eugenics came on the scene right around that time, and much of it should be looked at as an outgrowth of some of the existing efforts at charities and corrections work, for example, that were already institutionalized and ongoing.
Yeah, what you really, obviously, your book focuses on and points out is that this was not something happening outside the bounds of American religious institutions, but very much within those institutions and being promoted by many people associated with those institutions. Was it just sort of the promise that eugenics held out for providing real solutions to old problems like poverty that attracted American religious leaders to eugenics, or was it something else?
Well, there were two things at work. I think there was this effort to create some form of scientific charity, if you will, which is a phrase that pops up here and there in the papers of these charities and corrections meetings. A better way to provide charity and to alleviate these problems. But for religious leaders in particular, there was a real sense that their cultural and social power was waning, that they were having to give way to professional social science or professional charity workers, and that the prestige and the knowledge that was being amassed on the side of secular institutions was in some ways, although it wasn't always expressed this way, it was felt to be competition for what the work that the churches were doing. So particularly among more progressive minded and liberal Protestants and some Catholics and Jews, but mainly Protestants who were enamored of the social gospel, of the idea of transforming life here on earth as part of their Christian mission. This was a felt sense of, well, we either need to embrace these new ideas and be part of this progressive movement forward, which will improve everything, or we're going to be left behind. And I think that, particularly in the early years, now the tone of the eugenics movement does change as we get into the late teens and early 20s, and we can talk about that. But at the beginning, it was seen as this amazing tool with which a liberal and particularly liberal progressives who had already sort of embraced ideas around the social gospel could make sense of. This sounded like what they wanted to do, and it sounded scientific to them. It seemed like this much more sophisticated way of tackling social problems that they had long seen to be in their purview.
And of course, this is a time when, as you say, this is mainly a Protestant thing, not entirely, but mainly, and mainly embraced by more liberal or progressive aspects or branches of the Protestant sort of world. And it's a time, of course, when they are the ascent. That is the ascent. Those are the religious institutions in America. Were there critics even early on from within the Christian and Jewish worlds that had some premonition and could see ahead to where this might lead?
Yes, there were. I mean, in the late 19th and early 20th century, I did not uncover a ton of critics. The strongest and most vigorous critics emerged a little later, in the late 19 teens, early 1920s. But the ones who I did come across tended to be fundamentalist Christians. And by that, I mean, they did not stray from literal interpretations of scripture. They were generally suspicious of broad institutionalized efforts at social work and charity. They felt that, church-based, smaller community efforts were what were appropriate. And what was really interesting was to read their discussions of why these large-scale movements, eugenics in particular, were not respecting what the Bible said was their mission. So their idea was, you are taking, it's not our job to do this. And the dangers as they began to emerge were focused more, and particularly for Catholic critics of eugenics and some of the eugenic sterilization laws that came later, but also for fundamentalist Protestants, a sense that the new sciences that were emerging were for them also a threat to a lot of their teaching. So this should be seen within the context of this push and pull between faith and science at that time, which I have to add was not as dramatic as we sometimes now in retrospect believe it to be.
Right.
Yes, the Scopes monkey trial in 1927 was a dramatic cultural moment, but there had been a more cooperation than conflict in these decades. But for fundamentalists and for very text oriented sects of Protestantism, this was greeted with suspicion in the same way that the social gospel message was often greeted with suspicion.
What about Catholics? Was there even early on more of a sense among Catholic priests and religious in particular, maybe lay commentators, that that in some ways sort of the brokenness of humanity is a gift we're supposed to enter into and not try to solve forever, but instead is an opportunity, for grace, for salvation. Is that those sorts of conversations come up during this time with respect to eugenics?
Yes, there were, in some of the more technical theological journals where a lot of these arguments played out, they would have discussions about things like sterilization for mental illness. Again, this is pre any eugenic sterilization laws. So there had been ongoing conversations about, theologically, how do we approach something like sterilization, or how do we approach, so-called feeble-mindedness? And there was always a sense, at least among many of the Catholic, traditional Catholic theologians that I came across, that this was something that had to be understood first and foremost with humility, and that science was not to be assumed to have better answers to these questions than the faith. And because that was the starting point, not a suspicion of science necessarily,
right,
but an understanding that, we need to take this on board and look at it from our faith tradition and our faith perspective before we just go ahead barreling forward with new rules about marriage, for example. So the sacramental nature of much Catholic teaching really did protect them from getting caught up in these sort of fad-like waves of enthusiasms, because eugenics folks and the reformers who embraced eugenics wanted to change a lot of traditional institutions that were, again, under the purview of the Catholic Church, marriage being the most prominent, but also, questions about being able to bear children, and later contraception came into the mix. So yes, I think that's actually, it wasn't necessarily even something they realized at the time, but by following their faith tradition and asking questions through that lens, it did in a weird way prevent them from succumbing to some of the more extreme ideas that were prevalent at the time.
One of the things really stood out to me in reading your book when I was rereading it recently was, the advocates, almost all the advocates of eugenics, Herbert Spencer, Francis Galton, whom you already mentioned, Darwin's cousin, Margaret Sanger, were very self-consciously outspoken critics of charity. Like, charity is a real evil to them, and they attack it very much head on. Why did they hate? What made them hate charity so much?
So it was interesting, right? Because you would think, that they would see allies and activists who wanted to change the world in just like they did. But in fact, the eugenics arguments that they brought to the table, they had, and this is where it might be useful to understand that, positive eugenics versus negative eugenics. So there was a group of people who believed in what was called positive eugenics. And that was the idea that you should encourage the healthiest, the so-called best people to have as many kids as possible, right? So you want to have this, by the 1920s, this meant that at state fairs, you would have fitter family contests and all kinds of, the idea being good people should have lots of babies because that's going to be better for all of society because they will produce and raise good, healthy children, et cetera, et cetera. That's positive eugenics. But human nature being what it is, a lot more effort went into what was called negative eugenics. And this was the idea that the real problem wasn't that we aren't having enough good people reproduce. It's that too many of the bad people are reproducing. And by bad people, they had all kinds of pseudoscientific rankings. There was the feeble-minded being the most common term that was thrown about. So the idea of negative eugenics, which was the form embraced by people like Sanger and others, was that too many people who are feeble-minded are having too many kids. So we have to stop them. And charity, in their mind, encouraged that by giving people housing and food and money. it actually gave them an ability to be comfortable enough to continue to produce children. And even if these became people who were productive members of society, their germplasm, as it was then called, their feeble-minded traits would be passed on to their offspring. So again, this took to the charitable organizations, this argument that what you're doing is unscientific. And you'd see these, I mean, in retrospect, these kind of shocking ways of comparing what was going on. But, they would go to charity meetings and say, I mean, you wouldn't breed a weak horse with this. It's like breeding animals. How would you let them do this? This is so bad. But that's actually what they thought. They thought, again, to improve the whole human race, which was their goal, what they saw as a positive goal. Charity was undermining that by keeping alive, basically, generations of people who should otherwise not be born.
I think Galton didn't even sort of put forward sort of the trade, like, hey, we'll give you charity, but you have to give up your right to reproduce, like charity for sterilization trade.
There were a lot of evil bargains made and suggested in the movement. Yes.
How does philanthropy enter this picture? Then who are you already mentioned the Eugenics Record Office, but that was and Charles Davenport, but that was funded by philanthropy, and philanthropy really was behind a lot of this, was it not? The early philanthropic institutions.
Oh, absolutely. And some of the names that even Americans today would recognize, that are carved into many buildings. Rockefeller money funded eugenics. Carnegie millions funded this money. The Eugenics Record Office was money that was given by Mrs. Harriman, E.H. Harriman, who was the widow of a railroad magnate whose own daughter, Mary, had been a Eugenics Record Office worker, like a volunteer as a college student, and got to know Charles Davenport. And she, Mary, the daughter, was a very activist, progressive, sort of a young activist who wanted to change the world. And so she went to her mom and introduced her to Davenport, and they hit it off. And Harriman spent I believe her initial offering was tantamount to about $500,000. I mean, a lot of money at the time. To support Charles Davenport establishing a record office so that he could send out all of these college-age women out into the hinterlands, into the pine branches of New Jersey, all these areas of the country, and have them collect histories of feeble-minded families to bring back to him that he could then study to create some sort of record of eugenic degeneration in the country. So. And it wasn't just direct funds. A lot of the most elite colleges and universities at the time, which of course also were funded by very wealthy families, had courses in eugenics for students to take. Many Ivy League institutions, lots of the big state universities. There was money that was given to support state-run institutions, which then embraced eugenic sterilization laws later. So anywhere a liberal-minded or self-described progressive philanthropist had his or her name, mainly his in this era, but still anywhere that money went, it likely touched on eugenics in these years, because this was the cutting edge of scientific philanthropy. This was where all the smart liberal people wanted to be and where they wanted to put their money. Christine Rosen, we'll be right back and continue talking about eugenics, science, religion, and philanthropy in America. Right back. Okay, time for a little timeout, a little practicality with my friend and colleague, Dan Falta. How are you, Dan?
I'm doing great, Jeremy. It's great to be with you today.
Dan lives in Fishers, Indiana, beautiful Fishers, Indiana, on the northeast side of Indianapolis, of course, my home state. Although, didn't you go to Purdue? Do I have that right?
I did, and I know that could be a little bit of a conflict between you and I, but yeah, I think we could just put it past us for today.
You have so many, such heavy basketball bragging rights over Indiana right now that I really can't say anything. So we'll just sort of leave that off to a side like you recommend. Dan is a managing consultant for us and leads our capital campaigns consulting group. So we're going to talk a little bit about capital campaigns and this practicality. And because we only have a few minutes, we're going to zero in on this thing that if you have ever done a capital campaign, or your school or your church or your organization is considering a capital campaign, you've probably heard the term feasibility study, that you need to do a feasibility study. Dan, what the heck is a feasibility study and why do you need it?
Well, great question, Jeremy. And if you're ever contemplating a campaign, or you want to go into a capital campaign or any type of campaign at all, what a feasibility study does is it helps you prepare for that campaign and really take you through a process that is going to help you manage success for your campaign. So none of us want to fail in a campaign, right? And we know if we did fail, there could be several things that would become of that. And so what a feasibility study does is basically helps you be successful in your campaign.
So how does it do that? Like, what are the key deliverables? What do you get out of a feasibility study that kind of offers this insurance against failure that you're talking about?
Sure. You first you're creating a case for support, and you want to use that. That's fundraising lingo, but basically it's a document. It's a multi-page document that provides what you want to raise money for, why it's important, and why it's important for other people to support this fundraising campaign. And so you create this document to put in front of donors when you're going through a feasibility study. So you select a certain number of donors you want to interview, and these donors might be board members, they may be your top level donors, key stakeholders, and anywhere from 20 to 50 donors you want to interview. And so through these interviews, and it might be anywhere from 12 to 20 questions that you're asking them in these interviews, you will share ahead of time this case for support. Okay. And so you're testing their reaction to that document and the reason for this campaign. And these answers from the interviews will help tell you, is it feasible to do this campaign? Are people going to support it? What do they think of it? What are some of the key features of that case for support that they like or they dislike? What are some important messaging points that you can glean from those interviews that will help, when you actually initiate the campaign? So it's all the pre-campaign work that's done in the feasibility study. At the end, usually it's a third party that's conducting the feasibility study, and so at the end of these interviews, that consultant would really synthesize the answers, list out the key findings from those from those questions, and then provide recommendations as a final report.
So I've heard it said it's like, in a way, you're sort of only partially baking the cake, so to speak, and you're inviting in some of the key people you think could be big supporters of this capital campaign or historically have been key supporters of your organization. You're kind of inviting them into the process of baking the cake, so to speak. Is that a good way to put it? It's a terrible metaphor, maybe.
That's a great way. Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. And it's a good way to engage your key stakeholders. And it's a real high level form of cultivation. So not only are you getting this good information from these interviews, but you're also moving donors along the donor continuum towards ultimately making a gift. And that's what you want.
Are there misconceptions out there about feasibility studies, things that people get wrong about what they're supposed to do or how they work?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And one of the misconceptions is that you don't need to do a feasibility study. And
we hear that sometimes.
We know that's not right. But I've worked in the for-profit sector for 25 plus years, where I've kind of I've had feasibility studies done for campaigns for various reasons. And so I've seen the benefit firsthand of having one and not having one. And so I've never been part of a campaign over those years where it does not make sense to do a feasibility study, because you just want to guarantee success as much as possible.
Yeah.
And that planning helps you do so. Another misconception about feasibility studies is that the only thing it's good for is just telling you how much you can raise money
Right.
For a campaign. And that, while that is true, that's one of the key outcomes that you want to find out is, okay, is this campaign feasible? Can we raise the money?
Mm-hmm.
And what would donors give? But it also does so many other things. Like I said earlier, it cultivates the donors. It cultivates relationships. It helps your own development department go through a process that is really helpful for the future,
Mm-hmm.
not only for the organization, but for individuals, for professionals in the development business. So there's a lot of positive outcome that comes from a feasibility study, other than just the telling you what you can raise.
But you won't get those outcomes if you don't do the study. That's a key finding of this interview. It turns out to get the positive benefits of a feasibility study, you have to do a feasibility study. Good point.
Exactly. Yep. And it's an investment of time and money, but in the long run, it's worth it.
And if you're trying to raise millions of dollars, which you're trying to do with a capital campaign, typically, I mean, what's another, whatever it is, $50,000, $75,000 to really get it right. Dan, thanks so much for sharing.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Jeremy.
All right, we are back with Christine Rosen, senior editor at the New Atlantis, fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, and senior writer at Commentary Magazine, talking about her book, Preaching Eugenics, Religious Leaders and the American Eugenics Movement. And we're starting to get into the role of philanthropy in all of this. Do you know or remember when, let's put it this way, when does the movement begin to sort of lose steam? And why? And then how does philanthropy intersect with that, if at all?
Well, the movement's heydays really were late 19 teens and throughout the 20s. What happened beginning really began in the mid-20s, but it started to sort of reach public consciousness a little bit later, is that genetic science started to improve. We started to learn more about how genes actually work, what is and isn't heritable. And the genetic scientists some of whom had flirted or at least, lent their imprimatur to eugenics off and on over the years, started distancing themselves from eugenics. So there was an aspect of we're the real scientists. The geneticists saying what they're doing is a little kooky and not really very scientific. So that was one part of it. Another part of it, quite frankly, was that eugenics, and this will sound strange to some people, by the time eugenics was mainstreamed in the 20s, it wasn't considered radical even among progressives. What was considered radical and was actively pursued as a joint project was the birth control movement. And Margaret Sanger really aggressively trying to attach herself to the eugenics movement and its at the time its prestige. And so for a lot of this is a point at which you do see some of the philanthropy pulling back a little bit. They do not want to be associated with something as controversial at the time as contraception. This is definitely when the eugenics movement lost some of its more liberal Protestant and all of its Catholic adherents, the ones who put their name on letterheads saying, oh yeah, we support this as a matter of, improving the human race. So that was actually, those combined forces did a lot more damage to the movement long before you start to hear about what's planned for and going on in Europe in the 30s. So that timeline is important for Americans to remember, because the other thing that always strikes people as astonishing, and shouldn't be because we should know our own history better, is that we passed eugenic sterilization laws in this country decades before they ever did it in Nazi Germany. We did it here first. The Nazis admired the work that eugenicists did in this country and had some of them over to Germany to talk to them about this project. So the idea that we are somehow that we were different in terms of the faddish nature of these ideas and the embrace of them uncritically. No, I mean, it did happen here. It happened here, and we were doing it. And that legacy is something that, quite honestly, a lot of states in this country, which sterilized many of their citizens without their consent, and certainly without even telling them what they were doing to them, haven't really acknowledged. I mean, the state of Virginia is an exception. California really needs to do more about this. So there's still a lot of hidden history here that needs to see some sunlight.
Yes, one would think that in an age like ours, it would be picked up with some relish, but perhaps because the movement is associated with progressivism rather than sort of radical right-wing nuttiness, it's not. Wasn't Indiana the first state to have forced sterilization laws in the book?
Yes, it was. Yep.
Yeah. Has there been any official apology from them? Or North Carolina, I think, was early too. I may be wrong.
I don't know. So I know Virginia has actually done some, mainly because that's where the Buck versus Bell, the Supreme Court case that upheld involuntary sterilization, Carrie Buck, that all played out in Virginia. And they have done a really commendable work excavating and publicizing that history. But California probably sterilized more people than anyone else. New York did a lot of too. So many states, and again, it's all buried in their state institutional records, and there it will sit until historians continue to piece this together and tell that story.
Well, speaking of being buried in institutional records, that leads us to ask about philanthropic institutions. The Carnegie Foundation still around, Rockefeller still around, Russell Sage Foundation. I don't know if Russell Sage is still around actually, and there are others. What's either before your book came out or after your book came out? Has there been any sort of official acknowledgement of their role in this movement and expressions of regret and that sort of thing?
Oh no! And in fact, I think it was only recently that Planned Parenthood finally said something to the effect of, "Yes, well, Margaret Sanger had a few bad ideas. Oh, that kooky Margaret." But it literally was done in the spirit of, "Oh yes, well, everybody thought that way then." And they're not wrong that lots of people thought that way, but there were also a lot of people who understood that what was happening was morally wrong and spoke out. So I don't, the philanthropic institutions in particular are interesting to me because I think in the 90s and early 2000s, you did see a real concern about how a lot of these philanthropies were going overseas and sterilizing people for some, I mean, they called it population control, but there was a real eugenic tinge to the messaging there. And that really angered people here at home. But there really wasn't a full reckoning of in these places with what and again, for some of them, it's their founding members, it's the founding money. The Museum of Natural History actually was a place where there was a lot of, they had eugenics conferences there, and a lot of money that was given to that institution back in the day was also given by people who, supported eugenics. I think the problem is that it's one of those parts of our past that we want to forget. So we do. And I think for philanthropists, particularly like you said earlier, at this moment where they're really doing a reckoning, as they call it, they should make that reckoning a full reckoning and really look at their archives and see what was going on and what their money was supporting and the people it harmed.
Yeah, part of the reason why that hasn't happened has to be that it just doesn't fit the narrative of why bad things happened in the past that have been embraced by sort of elite institutions and elite figures.
Sorry to interrupt, but the progressive project in general is still something that many of these philanthropies support. So to chip away at their own base project could be dangerous because it's you start pulling on that thread in the sweater and the whole thing can unravel. So I think that's absolutely right. It's a very important point.
It would be nice if there were some pressure put on them, though. And other than the work of our friend Bill Shambra, books like yours and a couple of others, I'm sure they just don't feel any real pressure to do anything.
Right. Well, there's no public, like you said, the messaging is wrong and for them.
Let's back up a little bit. I'm curious, was eugenics, was it popular? Was it popular only among, again, elite figures and elite institutions, even elite religious, institutions and figures? Or did it have like broad mainstream public support among the American people?
It did for a while. particularly in the 20s, and you see it in pop culture. There were movies that had, eugenics themes. There was a whole movie about, a woman who's married someone, and it turned out, oh my goodness, he was hiding secret feeble-mindedness. I mean, it was a ridiculous plot, although less ridiculous than some of the made-for-TV movies I've seen. So perhaps not, but yes, and you also found it. I found a lot of examples of it in the mainstream magazines. The sort of the general interest magazines would have articles targeted particularly at women, and women of childbearing age heard a lot of these things, kind of advice and tips, not only on how to choose a husband, but you should look into his family, and lots of marriage advice. Well, what sounded like marriage advice, that in fact was eugenic advice, because it was all about how to have to avoid feeble-mindedness. And certainly, as I said earlier, they were teaching it in universities. But at state fairs in the middle of nowhere, you would have these better baby contests, and there are people who still sometimes. I worked with PBS on a documentary about part of the eugenics movement, and one of the producers told me she gets these emails from people who were cleaning out their grandparents' attic in Iowa and found these trophies and these medals, and they were sort of horrified. But this was it was like you had raised a prize steer, you had the prize family, and you got a medal for it. And you could go into a tent and you could get a physical exam by a eugenics worker, and at the international expositions and fairs, there was always a eugenics booth. So it was actually mainstream for at least a decade, if not longer.
Really extraordinary. I don't think people know this history at all, except through the things they find in the attics of their Iowa grandparents. Exactly. I suppose there were even eugenics sermon contests. I remember you talk about that in your book.
Yes, this was, and I have to tip my hat to Daniel Kevles, who wrote a wonderful survey of the American and the British eugenics movement back in the 80s. And he mentions these in passing. He mentions the sermon contest. And that just, for me, it really piqued my interest. So when I was at the archives of the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia for a couple of months researching, I got the box of sermons. It's literally a huge box of sermons that were submitted, again, from small town ministers, mainly Protestant, one or two Catholic writers, and one or two Jewish, liberal Jewish, Reformed Jewish rabbis. Mm-hmm. But it was fascinating to read because there was a contest that was sponsored by the American Eugenics Society. And one of the requirements was that to enter the contest, you had to give this sermon to your congregation. So they just didn't write a paper and turn it in and try to win a prize. They gave this sermon, and they would write these glowing front page letters saying, this was so popular. I gave this sermon 3 times in the same week. I mean, this, again, to speak to the kind of trickle down and popular effect of these ideas, they were popular enough that your everyday minister was preaching about it from his pulpit.
Wasn't there one, I'm going from memory here, but it may have been from one of these sermons, or maybe it's somebody else's writings, or, if Jesus were alive today, he'd be a eugenicist.
Yes, that actually was a common theme in many of the sermons. And there was, the American Eugenics Society hired sort of later in its existence, for lack of a better term, what was a sort of dodgy PR guy named Albert Wigham. And Wigham wrote these books where he would rewrite the 10 Commandments as eugenic commandments. I mean, he actually knew a lot about the Bible and about faith, but he really wanted to he argued also that eugenics should become our new religion. He said it explicitly, he wrote about it. That was the idea.
Extraordinary. I want to ask you, those are sort of the weird, funny, kind of troubling things, but not as troubling as the things I'm going to bring up now, and that maybe you can talk to us about a little bit, when we just sort of should make people aware of some of the more radical proposals made by eugenics advocates. I got 2 to start you off here with, Christine. A.O. Wright, the Reverend A.O. Wright, he was secretary of the Wisconsin State Board of Charities, said that the, quote, defective classes should be quarantined in state-sponsored colonies. Mm-hmm. And that was one serious idea put out there. And then John Glenn, not the astronaut, I hasten to add, but director of the Russell Sage Foundation, and this is your words, quote, endorsed state-sponsored segregation of feeble-minded men and women. Are those 2 of the more radical proposals, or did it get worse from there?
So those were actually those were on the less radical end of the spectrum. and a lot of those, again, growing out of the charities and corrections movements and sort of social work era, particularly in the early 20th century, there were homes, they were called homes for the feeble-minded. This is where people would take their children or relatives who they couldn't care for anymore themselves, or people who had run-ins with the law and were obviously not criminals, but couldn't be trusted to care for themselves or live safely at home. And so they would be turned over to the state and become wards of the state in these institutions. And once there, it really did depend on who ran the institution. So there were some of these institutional heads who were enthusiastic eugenicists, and they would just sterilize the women who came through and tell them that they were getting an appendectomy, for example, or just having a minor surgery. And so many of these women, when they finally left these institutions, if they did leave them, would go home and get married and wonder why they could never have children. So there were, at a state institutional level, each institution did have a lot of purview in terms of how it segregated what they called the so-called feeble-minded. And then at the state level, you also saw legislatures passing both efforts for what were called early on marriage health certificates, where people had to prove their family health to get married. That was popular for a little while, but then later in the teens and 20s, you saw sterilization laws. So as you said, Indiana, but other states passing laws allowing for the compulsory sterilization of the so-called feeble-minded, and the definitional the distinctions and definition of what was and wasn't feeble-minded were vast. So this could be someone who was annoying to their parents, or just someone who really was probably cognitively challenged, but in any case these were so-called dysgenic people who needed to not reproduce, and so they were sterilized against their will often.
You've already touched a little bit on how the Nazis did admire some of what they saw happening in the United States with respect to forced sterilization, et cetera. Of course, they pick up on this and give it this racial/ethnic twist. Were any of the progressive or other proponents of eugenics in America thinking along those lines? We keep touching on feeble-mindedness. It was essentially around like a more fit human being produced. But was there any sort of racial or ethnic cast to the eugenics movement here?
Oh, yes. And you find it.
I figured that was the answer.
Well, you see this in the one bit of our history that Americans do actually tend to know about, even if they don't understand the eugenic impulses that created it. And that was the Immigration Restriction Acts in the 1920s passed by Congress. Were targeting quotas on the entry into the U.S. of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. These are, I should say, people. They were my people. My grandparents, my great grandparents came during that wave, and they were largely Catholic and Jewish. So there was an effort this is where the sort of waspy nature of the eugenics movement took hold. They wanted the Mayflower families, right? That was the ideal for them racially. So anyone who was coming in from I mean, I guess the Irish got kind of grandfathered in, but Southern and Eastern Europeans who were at the time coming to the country in large numbers, often staying in cities on the East Coast, crowding the cities, which concerned people who lived there. So they were definitely one of the targets. And the Immigration Restriction Acts, many eugenicists, Harry Laughlin testified before Congress and gave his whole eugenic spiel for why we need to limit immigration for eugenic reasons. So that was definitely something that concerned them. Interestingly, and Edward Larson has written a remarkable history book about eugenics in the South. And in a weird way, the segregation policies that were in place in the South, I won't say protective function because that's not right, but because the state institutions are racially segregated, often you would see higher sterilization rates in white institutions in the South than in the institutions that were for African Americans. So there's a fascinating the way that the history of segregation in the South interplayed with the eugenics movement in the South. He tells that story in a really wonderful way. If people are interested in learning more about that.
It seems obvious, but we might as well state the obvious here that one of the lessons we ought to take from this history is that these sort of simple-minded yard sign declarations that we ought to trust the science or follow the science or we believe in science, whatever they say, are ridiculous, right? I mean, it's this is just one example of a time when the scientific community was all in from an allegedly scientific perspective on something that was atrocious.
Yes, I think my study of this era, whenever I saw a lot of people speaking this way, whenever you hear the science, capital T, capital S,
Mm-hmm.
be very, very skeptical. And yes, I mean, I think that's actually one of the ways in which, particularly when you're talking about activism, if people want the world to change and they claim they want to improve it, and I don't doubt that claim. I mean, I spent a lot of time reading, Margaret Sanger's letters and papers and those of lots of far more obscure activists in this era. They genuinely wanted to make the world a better place.
Mm-hmm.
But what they lacked in the pursuit of that was humility. And that, I think, for the people who did fight this and who did, eventually, the humility that came from being, for example, a geneticist in the early days of that discipline, they had humility when they came to the subject, and that was what the eugenicists lacked. So I think that humility is something we should always have. And science is a process. Science does not have special access to the truth. And I think what I fear going forward, and I ended up writing a little conclusion to the book, which, in retrospect seemed kind of depressing, but I think has been proven correct when we look at some of our new reproductive technologies. And that's that eugenics wasn't bad just because it was the state wielding its power against citizens. So a lot of Americans go, well, we can't, okay, that was terrible, that was bad, but we don't do that anymore. Eugenics is bad because the idea is that we have the power to manipulate human life in such a way as to forever alter every generation that comes afterwards. And we do have more of that power now. We have power the eugenicists could only have dreamed about. But human nature suggests we still lack the humility to wield it.
Do you think there's any chance that our experience in the last couple of years with COVID and everything that's surrounds that can produce a little bit more humility with respect to not only our attempts to manipulate our environments in perfectly sort of imperfect ways, but in terms of our sort of cultural regard for science with a capital S?
I think it does. And I think that's kind of a silver lining too. Look, I like institutions. I want them to flourish. I think it's always better to rebuild than to destroy. But there was a real humbling of and a totally understandable lack of trust particularly in public health institutions over the last few years, because there was an effort by the people who controlled those institutions to assume the worst about the rest of us, to assume we would do the wrong thing. So tell us one thing that wasn't true and then change their mind. And there wasn't trust. That's what broke down the trust. It wasn't people refusing to listen to the experts. It's that the experts lied to the people. And I think whenever you have experts who claim to represent the science or public health, deliberately lying or obfuscating or politicizing their work, that trust will erode and something new needs to be rebuilt in its stead. And so in some sense down the line, I hope it'll make for a more transparent, honest, and rigorous form of public health, particularly in messaging when crises erupt. But it's been a very hard way to learn that lesson for a lot of people. And the politicization of it, actually, because having studied eugenics, which was a very politicized form of science, we can learn from that too. We can learn about why that's dangerous, why it's dangerous to jump on the next new thing and declare it the only way to go about doing things. No, it's really not. We know from our past experience that politicians have to lead and make tough choices. They should certainly consult scientists and they should consult experts, but ultimately leadership is about making a decision, weighing risks and benefits for everyone. And that's not necessarily going to please the public health experts or the scientists every time.
Yeah, nor is it the domain of public health experts or scientists.
Exactly.
Indeed. Christine Rosen, thank you so much for bringing this fascinating but deeply troubling history to light in your book and for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, where can people, are you on Twitter or things like this, Christine?
So in my other life of studying technology, I am not on social media, I have to say, but I do have,
Good for you.
I have an email address at commentarymagazine.org, C Rosen, CROSEN at commentary.org. People are welcome to email me any questions they might have. And the book's on Amazon. It's very expensive because it's got a lot of footnotes. So
it's a great book. It's very readable. Don't be scared by what she just said. It's just the depth of scholarship is present in the footnotes. But yes, it's available on Amazon, or I might add, probably not on Amazon, like A Libris or Bookshop.
Yes, you can get used copies. You can also get a digital copy, which is actually how most of them sell these days.
Okay. Thanks so much, Christine. I appreciate it.
Thank you.